Here we are working on an SK800. It's a pre-war model. We can see that the parts here, these wheels are shinier from pre-war production. These are kind of a duller gray color. These are also shiny, the trailer wheels. So it's kind of a mix of pre-war and some early post-war 1945 style parts. It's got the original box here. The lid is over there. It's missing the label, unfortunately, but has the wrapping as well. The tender is in pretty rough condition, cracked, broken into pieces, but we'll reassemble it. As we can see, the inside is green in color, and that's because some of the green pre-war tenders were actually overpainted black. I don't know if Marklin made an excess of them or they just painted them all black and then repainted them green over the top, but that's how they were. So we will save the tender for later and are going to start working on the locomotive now. The goal is to get it running, remove any surface rust, and check any parts for zinc pest, and just make sure it's in good condition overall. So to start, there's lots of parts to remove in order to get the housing off. Typically, you can always remove the light bulbs. Because later we'll remove the holder. I like taking the trailer trucks off just because they get in the way. Take those off. Next, we can remove, let's see, might as well take the brushes out. The brush covers have to come off in order to remove the housing. And sometimes these brush covers, the holder will slip. And so what I do there is take a pair of pliers. You'd want one smaller than these, but you can actually hold the brush holder from underneath the bottom part while you unscrew it, because sometimes they slip because they are just press fit into the metal. That actually might, okay, we got lucky there. Another thing you can do is take some locomotive oil and drop it into the threading to loosen the threading and let it spin better. So now we're going to take the springs out. Be very careful with those. They do jump around. I like to hold them from the inside. If you do it from here, they'll jump, but if you hold it with tweezers in there, then they're not going to spring anywhere. So there are 2 brushes in here, so we'll just be careful. I'll just flip it over, see if they come out. There's our carbon brush. So that one dropped out, and the copper coil brush is usually stuck in there. A good way to remove that is with a needle, just to drop the needle in and you can pull it out. I don't have a needle here at the moment, so we'll get that out later. Moving on, what we can remove next is, let's go with the linkages. So there's a couple ways to do this as well. I leave this linkage on the housing and I take this one off. We should be using a bigger screwdriver so we don't strip the screws. You're going to want to press down pretty hard to get a good bite on the screw. And then there will be a spacer here. Take the spacer out, move those, so now we're clear of that. We'll do the other side just the same. And we can see there is some surface rust on the linkages that we'll remove later with a wire brush, and also with the Dremel tool. Remove the spacer. Now our linkages are clear and looks like our wheels have fallen off because they are just press fit on there. So later we'll glue those back. And our motor is locked up. I can see that the armature is pressing against the motor shield. So from here we just have these three and these two screws to remove. This one connects the chassis to the front truck holder. It's a long screw. Remove that one. Let's remove the back two. And there may or may not be spacers in between the frame and the housing. Looks like there's just one spacer here. And the other one that actually was stuck to the chassis. So we had two spacers there, that's good. From here we can remove, looks like that'll come out without removing the front truck holder. So we'll actually just remove the front lamp holder. It's a very small screw. And now we should be clear to move it out. Let's make sure this solder connection to the lamp holder is very brittle, and if it breaks it's difficult to repair. So we're actually, just to be safe, let's remove this as well. It's pretty easy to take off. These are short screws. Take that out. And now it'll come completely up and out. And we'll just bring it forward because of the push button. Oh, and we have actually one more. This is not always connected here, so that's loose now. Now we want to take the back sockets. These are for lighting of coaches, so we're gonna unscrew these two, and then our socket will drop down. Smaller screwdriver, and we're clear there. We'll set that there. We've got two more spaces here. We'll want to take those screws out. And there's our housing. It looks pretty good. So we'll set that down. And here we've got our chassis. Looks like the lots of things are jammed up here, but our reversing unit might work. It's a little loose. So we'll probably end up taking it apart anyway, but we can tighten that here. Now it doesn't wiggle as much. So later we'll oil this, we'll oil that, so it slides and retracts very easily, but our reversing unit might actually work here. Except there's a lot of corrosion and rust in there that we'll have to take off. But there's a good chance this will run. We don't have any zinc pests, it looks like, which is very good. These wheels don't seem to be turning, so they're locked up. But this will be our next step, is just to get it running by hand, and then we'll test with the electricity. And we're back. I've got some Labelle 107 synthetic oil. This is my favorite oil. I haven't really used too many others, but it's worked great, so I stick with it. Now some of the areas that we're going to want to oil, let's get the gears meshing first. So some important parts are where the gear rubs against the frame. We'll get that there. These two small gears are very important in between there. And I usually just run some along the gear itself. In between here, anywhere that the wheel rubs is going to be important to oil. Drop one in here on this spongy thing. We're going to drop some here where the gear meets the back motor housing. Another one here on this sponge and on that axle. And let's see if that's enough to turn it by hand. And looks like it was. So that is now running smoothly. Our wheels did come off. So we'll line those again because there's nothing holding it in. But that looks like it was enough to get it running, and that's running very well. That's a great smooth motor. So what we can do now, let's actually remove these two wheels. Because they're not aligned, they're going to prevent us from running the motor. But now that that's out, we can actually test the electrical function. So we're probably not going to need any more oil. Put that away. And from here, like I said, we'll test the electrical function. This armature seems great. And actually, while we're at it, let's bring the oil back out. So just to make this a little smoother, we're going to drop some oil here around this thing that turns. And we just want to make sure it retracts every time we plunge that forward. That the spring will bring it back, but we want it to be very clear, otherwise it will stick. And so we can actually oil the rod itself and then remove some of the excess oil. That helped quite a bit. While we're here, we'll just clean off some of that grime and rust. And the oil does a pretty good job of helping with remove the rust as well. See, there's quite a bit of rust and dirt on there. And let's try our best to clean off these contacts. That did a really good job of cleaning that. There's some hair that comes off. We just want all these contacts to be clean. So that's looking really good, that reversing unit. A real common problem is that these two contacts here don't actually touch the cylinder. And so what you can do in that case is jam something under there, lift it up a bit, and then bend the tab down. And then it makes a really good contact to the cylinder so that when it spins, we're alternating the direction there. But those two contacts look really good, so I'm pretty confident that this will run right up. So let's drop the carbon brush back in there. We'll drop that in there, and we can see the other copper one is in there. If you hold it like that, you can see the two little brushes. We'll drop the springs in there. Again, watch out for them jumping around. You don't want them to spring out because they're very easy to lose. And the cover, I put, if they're different colors, I put the darker one on the carbon and the lighter one on the copper. Although these look like they're pretty much about the same color. So now we're all set there. Let's get our transformer. We'll apply power to the pickup slider, and then you can either do it to the frame or to this hookup here. Now we're at the stage of testing the locomotive. I've got two leads hooked up to a 20-volt transformer, and I should be using alligator clips here, but I don't have any at the moment. Alligator clips just make it a lot easier. But we've got one hooked up to the chassis and one hooked up that we can touch to the pickup slider. So let's test that out. We can see that the reversing unit, the electromagnet is definitely trying. So we'll turn up the dial to increase the voltage, and it looks like we're running pretty well there. So now the reversing unit has engaged, and so we've reversed. We'll hit it again. And now we're running in reverse there. And forward. So it looks like we've got a pretty solid motor here that's working really well. Yeah, I think this is great. There's probably not much to do to it. We can maybe just turning that by hand. It's pretty loose. Let's clean off this gear a little bit. And we'll oil this again. And just run the oil through by hand. Still pretty tight. Let's drop some oil in here. That loosened it up quite a bit. And let's just do one more test. Yeah, it's running great. We had a few misclicks on the reversing unit, but that's pretty normal. Maybe just our contacts aren't perfectly aligned, but it's looking pretty good. Can maybe clean that a little bit more. Any dirt on these contacts is going to prevent it from reversing. And actually, the unit is still sliding up. So let's just tighten this screw a little bit more. There, now it's a lot firmer in there. That's looking great. Some other electrical functions, not too much more to test. Let's clean these pickup shoes off. Now we're on to probably the most difficult part, is aligning the wheels. This is challenging because the linkage, all three have to be in alignment. Luckily, because they're all geared, they all move together. So if you set it right and the wheels are strongly attached to the gears, then you shouldn't have any problems. But sometimes they slip, and then your linkage will jam because they are no longer in alignment. So we're just cleaning these off. Any dirt and grime in there. And we've got some rust on here. It's pretty bad. We'll probably have to try and buff that out. We can do that even after the wheels are installed and aligned. So we'll start with the geared side. That's the most important side. And you know the linkage is in the right direction if these little knobs are pointing up. So we'll align it so that all of the linkage screws are pointing to the right. That's just how we'll keep it all aligned. We'll drop that in, and they will fit exactly into the gears. And here's a problem. It looks like the wheel is loose from the gear. That's something that we really don't want. And that one's okay, this one's good, but this one is loose. And what happens there is that the gears will move and the wheel doesn't, and then you get jamming in the linkage. So to fix that, we'll just drop a super glue on there to secure it in place. And then our wheels will all be in alignment and will turn together. But let's see, as we turn it by hand by rolling this top gear, they do seem to all move together, and we can test it under electricity, but when this slides, it's probably going to jam. So I can actually demonstrate that here. So that looks like a jam already. Try it one more time. Turn the power down a little bit so it doesn't reverse. Yep, that clicking noise is because of the linkage. But it does seem to be running pretty well. I can actually feel it shocking my right hand a little bit, so we probably got a light short, but that's expected. So it's running pretty well. It's a little bit too tight, so we're probably going to have to oil it up a little bit more in these 3 gears. So now I have glued that wheel to the gear, and unfortunately I did it off camera because my super glue here was fully clogged up, and then I poked a hole in it and it came out, and I had to act quickly. But it's a pretty simple process of gluing it down because it's a tight fit. The glue, it adheres very, very quickly. And as you can hear, our clicking is completely gone. That is a great smooth running motor. We did just get a jam there. We'll just put some more oil on there. I haven't re-oiled it since I attached all the wheels, so they're probably just a little bit tight. And there's our forward. So we're getting good reversing here, and reverse, and reverse again, and running forward. That's really great. That's probably one of the best running motors I've seen in a while. So that's looking great. Now what we have to do is tie in the other side, and this is the most important part. So we want to make sure our wheels don't fall out and stay in alignment. So we'll keep those there, and then we're going to fit our other side on here. Line up the linkages. Once again, these dots facing upward. And so those are pretty loose. And so we're going to want to glue those on. And the way that I like to do that, let's actually we want to hold these wheels in place. And because they're tempted to fall out, we are going to slide a paper towel under there, just to make sure our wheels don't change gears. That looks like they're in alignment there. Yep, they all clear. So this will just help hold them in while it's resting there. And once they're locked in, you pretty much can't do any adjustments, so we want to make sure we get this right. So we'll take this first one off. Squeeze some glue out the side here. Drop it on the top of the axle as much as you can so that when you slide it over, it brings the glue down. And we'll set that about there. I usually like to fill in some at the top. Obviously we want room for that linkage to go over, and then we'll just kind of work it in. Pretty soon it should start hardening and we shouldn't be able to slide it much more. Just double check that our bottom wheel is flush up against this. Sometimes it pops out, but our gears are linked. And it looks like it still hasn't dried yet. So once that catches, then we'll be good to move on to the next one. We'll keep it upright for now. We can actually start moving on to the next one. That's no problem. Should start stiffening up pretty soon, but we'll move on to this one. Drop the glue on the very end of the axle. And drop it down. It's pretty loose as well. Our gears are lined up. Kind of bring that one up just a little bit. We'll make sure all of our holes are lined up. That one seemed to lock in a little bit better. That one's still moving, but not quite as much. That one's starting to lock up. And while we're here, let's add some oil to that seam just so that no glue hardens in between there. Otherwise our wheels will be stuck. So let's let that sit for a little bit. We should, looks like that one locked up, which is good. We can turn it just a little bit and they all move together, which is good. So we're just going to wait until that wheel adheres to the axle. Alright, the glue is hardened a little bit. It'll probably take some more time to fully cure. But let's test out the function here. So that's looking pretty good. I did adjust some of the wheels by hand, just very slightly turning them. This is still our loose one, but because the linkage is connected, it's brought into the right position. So this is pretty rare that it's running so well. Typically, this linkage will not be parallel to the ground, and it'll be at an angle a bit, and that just means your wheels need to be turned by hand to make sure it's straight. May have lost power here. There, it's back. So we're running pretty well now, so I think we're good with the electrical test. Let's check on that one wheel that was loose. It has hardened a little bit. We can apply a little bit more glue. It could be that the axle had some oil on it, which I should have removed. If there's any oil, the glue is not going to adhere to it, because the oil barrier will prevent the glue from attaching to the metal. But it should be okay. If there's a problem, we'll take it off, scrape and remove the oil and the old glue, and then do a new coat, and that'll set in. But I think we're looking good. We can always fix that even once the housing is back on and it's all assembled. There is some white residue on here that we can just remove with a Q-tip. Probably come in with a wire brush at some point and remove a lot more of the little surface rust. Also on the housing, there's some oxidation and different things, and we can just try and remove that with a Q-tip. As you can see, that all comes off pretty well. I wouldn't recommend using any substances on here. It's just not really necessary, because the plain Q-tip does a pretty good job. And not much concern about damaging paint or anything like that, because this shell is chemically burnished. So the only paint is the silver striping there. So we're able to get it back into pretty good shape. Clean up the cab a little bit. It's looking really good. See if our wheel, okay, that definitely has dried a little bit and is not so loose. Let's see if we can get one more test run in before we reassemble it. Yeah, it's working great. So from here, we don't have to test the light bulbs, because we can always replace those later. I think both of them ended up being out. So now we can just go back into full-on reassembly. Maybe clean these linkages while we're here. We did have the rust on one side. You know, a lot of that just comes right off just by brushing it a little bit with the Q-tip. It is going to leave some of the coating. So these are plated perhaps with nickel or something, and the rust basically oxidizes and replaces that coating with basically the brown rust that you see. So it does expose some bare metal, which is not great, but as long as it's stored in a good environment going forward, then you won't have additional oxidation. So might as well just take off the rust that we see. And as you can see, a lot of that rust is coming off. So that looks pretty good. I probably won't use the Dremel, just might be a little too aggressive. And that really doesn't look too bad, especially once we remove all the the rust coloring. So we'll just keep that as is. Let's run one more hand test. Yeah, everything's moving fine. Might as well oil it a little bit more. Work the oil in there. And let's move on to reassembling. So we have to take the brush covers off again. And our springs. If we're careful, if we keep this side facing up, then we can keep both of the brushes in there and they won't fall out. So let's see. I like to put this front truck holder in there, and then we slide it all in together. And this will actually go about right here. Being very careful not to break any of the soldering connections. Before we drop this in totally, I'm going to insert the screw, smallest screw for the front lamp holder. And place that down. Once again, you really don't want to break this solder connection there. And we'll put this wire underneath. And slowly drop that down. We'll move the holder into place, lift it up slightly. Try and find where the hole is. We'll just keep turning until we find it. Whoops. This is one of the more difficult screws to get in. Looks like we found our hole, but the screwdriver's too big. And we got it. We'll just center it as much as possible. Might have to adjust that later when we put the actual bulbs in. So now, let's see, what can we do next? Let's go ahead and put these back two in. Let's find the screws. So they're these very small, short screws. And then we will hold the holder with our tweezers as we turn. And it should catch. Oh, looks like we're using the wrong screws here. They are way too short. Here they are, slightly longer. So they actually go through. The screws we were using were the ones for the linkages. They're pretty similar. And we'll just keep moving it around until we get it connected. Looks like we got it connected there. Let's do the second one before screwing that one all the way in. Got them both connected, tighten them down. And this wire is a little bit close, but it's actually not rubbing into anything. So next, we're going to add our spacers in. One spacer under here. Another one here. Now these spacers just give it a little bit more room. The gear on the very top of the motor sometimes can rub against the top of the housing, so I think that's why they put the spacers in occasionally. I've had locomotives where I've had to stack 3 spacers up because it was rubbing so much against the top housing. We'll just get those in loosely. And let's see, we'll actually take this out for a sec. I believe there were 2 spacers under there as well, so we'll add those in. These are probably not as important. And looks like we lost the spacer somewhere in there. Oh, that was the first one. Where'd that second spacer go? Oh, there it is. Don't know how it got back there. And both our spacers are in. I'm actually worried that I reversed the spacers. Let's make sure that the screw fits in there. And it doesn't, so I guess the spacers are different sizes. So we got to take these spacers out and put them in the front. That's why we don't screw it in all the way. So those spacers are slightly bigger. Now we seem to have lost. Oh, all of our spacers ended up here. Okay. These look all very similar. These definitely are the front two because they're bigger. And they actually fit. So we'll put those two in the front, and the back two are smaller. Looks like we're all lined up. We'll drop our screws in. Whoops. We can tighten that all the way down because the chassis is still actually movable. And we can slide these spacers underneath. Try and get them to catch. And it's proven to be pretty difficult to find where that hole is. Got that one, no problem. And that one too. Tighten those all the way down. Now our chassis is pretty well secured. Let's drop the long, skinny one. We got lucky and that lined up perfectly. And see, some of the last steps are now to, oh, we lost our carbon. Might as well do that now. That brush is rubbing really close to the housing. We might have to adjust that moving this forward, but there's really not much room for adjustment. So let's move these wheels down by hand just a little bit. I see our glue is setting a little bit more. So we'll want to put the spacer in to line that up a little bit better. Drop our linkage down. The linkage slides into the housing, that's why it wasn't working. Let's move this toward us a little bit. And drop our very tiny screw onto here first. And there is a small notch in that. Oh, where'd our screw go? So let's actually roll this. We'll bring this arm over and move this a little bit so that it lines up with a flat notch in the cylinder, and that's what holds it in. You want to tighten that down because that stays stationary as the wheel moves. And it works just like that. Flip over and do the other side. Let's put our spacer in. It's a real bad spot for the oil. Let's cap that off while we're here. Our spacer's in, put in our bottom linkage. And our small screw is the last one in the bin. That's real lucky. So that's a little tight. Let's actually oil that, since that's supposed to move freely. And do one final test. Looks like we got a small issue here. Okay, that's rubbing against here, so we've got this at a bad angle. So let's actually rotate that so that it's up higher. That's better. And now our final electrical test, just to make sure it's still running. We can put it on its back, bring over our transformer, and this is the moment of truth. Well, this is definitely something that happens. It might be bad brushes, actually. I can see they're sparking a little bit. It is trying to run. We might even have some rubbing against the housing. Let's do a hand test. So it's still a little bit tight. This actually may help it run better. Let's add some more oil. Let's oil all that we can from the outside. Linkages are maybe a little tight as well. That helped a bit. Let's give that a test. Sometimes if we loosen these two back screws, it might give us a little bit more room for the gears to move. Oops. Yeah, we don't want that. This is where it really helps to have the alligator clips. So that sparking is just because it's kind of bouncing off the metal. Because it's running so weak, it's either we've got too much friction on the wheels or we've got a short somewhere. Yeah, it is pretty tight still. Let's try and oil inside the motor a little bit more. Loosen things up a little. Still pretty tight, but and that helped. You know, it may be that these are really not much room in there. And we've definitely got some friction in there, but it is running better. You can see it's really trying. But that might be good enough to at least pull some coaches. And I'm not running a full 20 volts here, so we might have better luck with a real old Marklin transformer. I can see some of the gears are even not quite straight. But we are moving pretty well there. So we're going to call that a success. I think with some additional oiling and a more powerful transformer, this will be running down the tracks pretty smoothly. I don't think loosening these helped any, so I'm going to tighten it back down so it's not moving. We'll let it sit. The glue's going to dry a little bit more. Let's put those final trucks on. Again, there's some rust on here that we can clean off. And there's no difference between front and back, so we'll just screw those on. Screw it down until it hits the bolt. This bolt is all the way, so screw that in a little bit, holding the bolt, and then line it up with the front support. Screw that in as well. And there we go. We got a fully functional SK800K locomotive. The tender will be next. But we got it so that it was in a completely stuck state to being able to roll it pretty smoothly with just our fingers there. And runs and reverses pretty well, and all the parts looked great. And so that's our locomotive for today. And next time we will be repairing this very broken tender. We'll super glue it together, probably reinforce it a bit from the inside, and secure it to the base. So thanks for watching.